guys, so in today's video, I want to address this question of whether or not we can think of the Buddha and Christ as really being sort of the same thing. Can we just throw an equal sign in between Christ and Buddha and call it a day? Stay tuned. So one of the most common questions that viewers will ask me when they're just introduced to the perennial philosophy is whether or not these notions of Christ, Buddha, and Krishna are all really just the same idea or the same personality dressed up in different cultural ways. It's self-evident that these are different mythological concepts just due to the fact that they come from different mythological traditions. Consider the fact that Christ is primarily thought of as a king, a monarch who rules over the nation of Israel and is responsible for administering the distribution of the kingdom of God out over the face of the earth. It's an apocalyptic vision of a messianic king from God who will bring justice and order in the face of evil here on earth. Whereas the understanding of the Buddha is simply one who has become awakened to the true nature of their mind. The word Buddha means the awakened one, and Krishna is the mythological idea that Vishnu will come down from heaven and incarnate himself in a physical form when irreligion and sin spread out and become too prolific. So these are very similar in certain ways. I mean, all three of these mythological figures are said to have come down from heaven. So albeit these various different mythic forms share a lot of similarities, they are distinct in some very important ways. And in fact, it's become kind of a popular thing recently to critique Christianity by trying to show that Christianity is really just a copycat religion, that all these other religions are exactly the same, right? So you'll find films like Zeitgeist that argue that the Buddha and Attis and Krishna and Mithras and all these different mythological heroes are all exactly the same as Christ.
Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected. Krishna of India, born of the Virgin Devaki, with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and upon his death was resurrected.
I'll tell you guys right now, this is incredibly misleading. This is a huge portion of misinformation. In fact, it was quoted on the film Religulous, and Bill Maher, he prides himself as an intellectual atheist, but I'm surprised that he let this slip through. You know, he talks about how Christ was the same as all these other mythological figures.
We've got Krishna, who was in India 1,000 years before Christ. Krishna was a carpenter, born of a virgin, baptized in a river.
Are you saying that was written in history? That was written down in history, is what you're saying?
Absolutely.
It's absolutely not true, okay? There are similarities, there are distinct similarities, but not all of these mythic figures were born on December 25th. I don't know of any of them that were baptized. And Buddha was not born of a virgin. He was born of the lady Maya, who was in fact married to the king of India at that time. Some people have argued that Krishna was born of a virgin, but Krishna was actually the 8th child of his mother, so I'm not really sure how that works. But the point is that if you hear people making these assertions that Jesus is exactly the same as all these other mythological heroes, make sure you do your fact-checking, because there is a ton of misinformation out there. Jesus is very distinct from some of these mythological figures. That being said, we do see certain mythological parallels. For instance, we discussed in my last video the experience of Odin being hung from a tree. Of course, he was hung by his legs, and he was never crucified to the tree. But we definitely see within a number of different mythological traditions this idea of the hero being tied to a tree, hung to a tree, nailed to a tree, some kind of form of this. Crucifixion is a common form that we see in a number of different mythological traditions and beliefs. One that is a particular favorite of mine recently, because I've only just come to know about it here in the last few weeks, is the myth surrounding the hero of Blackfoot religion called Scarface. Scarface was said to be a star child, a child of the morning star, and he helped the people of the Blackfoot Nation come to know the sun dance and the power of this ceremony. It's said that during one of these sun dances, he was hung from a Y-shaped cottonwood tree with his arms outstretched and tied by bands of raw hide, and over the top of his head was given to him a crown of juniper branches, and the thorns of that started to dig into his face, and blood started running down. So, I mean, this is incredibly similar to what we see in Christianity. One of my favorite examples of these kinds of parallels is the story surrounding Mistapeo among the Naskapi Indians. This was a concept I was introduced to when I was reading Carl Gustav Jung's Man and His Symbols. They had this idea that Mistapeo, my good friend, was the indweller of the heart, and he would move from lifetime to lifetime. As each Naskapi Indian died, his Mistapeo would move on to be reincarnated inside of someone else. And Mistapeo was responsible for sending the Naskapi their dreams, and so the Naskapi would try to listen to the wisdom of Mistapeo in their dreams and to express it in art. In this way, the Naskapi Indians were brought into conformity with the powers of nature, and they could predict where the good hunting would be, or perhaps when a storm would come. And so this was a way in which the Naskapi lived in conformity and unity with the natural environment around them. Of course, this concept is incredibly similar to what we see in Buddhism, the idea of the Buddha nature that dwells within someone's heart and that moves from lifetime to lifetime. The reason I love this concept so much is because we can know for a fact that the Naskapi were not in any way influenced by Indian ideas. In fact, I'm pretty confident that probably still to this day the Naskapi don't know anything about Hinduism or Buddhism. Maybe somebody's let them know that their mythic forms are incredibly similar to those of India. But it's a great example of how separate cultures will come to the same mythological conclusions without being in direct contact with one another. So these parallels are the direct result of what Carl Gustav Jung called the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Now, the easiest way to understand this is to think of the archetypes of the unconscious as being the wisdom of the body. These are the forms that our instincts will take in the context of dreams and hallucinations. You see, the difficulty is here, though, is that the powers of the unconscious don't come to us in well-defined concepts and neat and tidy ideas. You see, we develop that. That's the job of religion, is to form a kind of framework into which these energies can be injected. The way I like to visualize this is with water. Consider you have a bowl of water filled with different colors, different paints, right? Each of these colors can represent one of these archetypal energies of the unconscious mind. But notice how none of these powers are very well defined. They mix and swirl and blend in with one another. This is really the true nature of the unconscious mind. It's not well defined. It's not in any way concise or decisive, right? It's not like one power ends here and another begins there. Carl Gustav Jung referred to this as the contamination of unconscious contents. You see, Carl Gustav Jung recognized that the unconscious mind was very fluidic and that it would move and shift and blend in various different ways. So when he developed a system for understanding the unconscious mind, he left it very simplistic. He only developed 4 distinct psychological powers, namely the ego, the shadow, the anima, animus, and the self-archetype. But even these definitions he found would sometimes bleed into one another, and this is where he came up with the term, the contamination of unconscious contents. That's when perhaps some of the powers of the shadow blend in with the powers of the anima, and you can no longer really distinguish between the two. You see, that's because all of the concepts that we use, both psychological and mythological, are really rather arbitrary. The true nature of the unconscious mind is in no way well defined or very distinct. I would argue that the only well-defined distinct thing in the unconscious mind is the luminosity of the Dharmakaya, the white light that people will see when they undergo a near-death experience. But other than that, pretty much everything in the unconscious mind will mix and blend and merge and move around with one another. And in fact, we see this in a variety of different mythological traditions. Consider some of the gods of the ancient Egyptians, Amun and Ra and Ta. These were all creator deities. And yet, oddly enough, throughout the history of ancient Egypt, many of these gods would simply be merged together. They'd be blended as if they were one, creating gods such as Amun-Ra. We see the same thing within Greek mythology. The ancient Greeks of the Hellenistic period would simply synthesize Greek gods together with Egyptian gods, as in the case of Hermes and Thoth. So that all of these various definitions, all of these mythological concepts, whether it's the definition of a deity or even the definition of a particular psychological tendency, they don't allow us to force them into these, confines, right? They don't come to us always in the way we want them to. And this is one of the reasons why orthodoxy in religion is so bloody difficult, because God seems to refuse to do what you want him to do. This is one of the reasons why, if you look throughout the history of religious tradition, there will always be some kind of a mystic, some kind of a hero who has a direct experience of God. He teaches his wisdom to the people, and then the people take that wisdom and they systematize it. They put it all down on paper and they break it all up into nice, neat, and tidy concepts until basically they've squeezed the life right out of that religion. And then everyone's sort of left standing around going, why did God stop talking to us? At which point a new mystic comes in and shatters all those concepts, breaks open all of those ideas, and reintroduces the powers of the unconscious mind. At which point his followers go to work building back up these egotistical concepts and ideas, and thereby they choke out the life out of the religion all over again. And this we've seen especially in the Abrahamic faiths. You'll often notice that people who have the most profound religious experiences are seldom well trained in theology. In fact, they tend to be largely unaware of many of these religious concepts, which allows them to remain open to the reality of the unconscious mind as that reality chooses to reveal itself as a mystery. This is one of the reasons why Hinduism has been able to preserve such a profoundly powerful tradition, because in Hinduism, they don't even have a concept for orthodoxy. Everything is referenced back to the direct first-hand experience of the yogis and the mystics. The fascinating thing, though, about encountering the unconscious mind is that we will find that sometimes the unconscious mind will actually cooperate with a religious system. The powers and forces of the unconscious are mysterious and fluidic, but if a person adopts a long-standing religious method, then you will actually discover these powers assume particular concepts. They will actually come in and occupy the orthodox ideas of the tradition. And this really is a great testament to the intelligence of these powers, and this is one of the reasons why it's clear ancient people regarded these powers as gods. They regarded them as persons in their own right. But when we approach the issue of trying to understand whether or not Christ and the Buddha are the same thing, the important thing here is to recognize that Christ and the Buddha belong to distinct traditions, so that the concept of Christ and the concept of the Buddha are just that. They're concepts. They are concepts that encourage the unconscious mind to represent itself in a particular way. So that really, Christ is really something that only exists in our minds, and so too is the Buddha. These are just ideas that we use to make sense out of a deep and profound mystery. So saying that Christ is the same thing as Buddha only betrays the fact that we don't properly understand the nature of these things. Because what you're doing is you're still functioning through the concepts, and no one has clearly introduced you to the mysterious reality of the unconscious mind. So instead of speaking in terms of Christ and Buddha, we could instead speak in terms of archetypal images. Notice how there are some distinctions. Buddha is not a king, whereas Christ is a king. Christ is not really an awakened one. And we can look at other concepts, other mythological themes or details regarding these figures that are quite distinct. And this is important to recognize. And it's also equally important to recognize that these concepts and ideas are only the means through which we attempt to make sense out of and understand the realities of the spirit realm, the realities of the unconscious mind. These are mysteries, and they will never fully comply with our well-defined concepts and ideas. We have to accept the fact that God, in all of his wonder and mystery, is just that, a mystery. And in spite of all our sincere efforts to try and define a nice little neat box for God to fit inside of, he will always break out of it. And he will always remind us that he is God, and that we are not. So I hope this answers your guys' question. I know this is a very complex set of ideas, but I've done my best to communicate it. And if you've enjoyed this video and you've found it insightful, I'd ask you to please like, subscribe, and share. Be sure to stick around and hit that notification bell so you know when I come out with new content. And as always, thanks for watching.